Throughout horror fiction, the idea of the giant monster, the colossus, the kaiju, the leviathan, has functioned as a symbol. Whether it's Godzilla's representation of atomic warfare, Cthulhu's representation of the unknowable depths of the universe, or the Leviathan representing the fact that the world does not reward personal goodness, giant monsters have always stood for something more. Perhaps because of this, giant monster horror, or kaiju horror, is one of the oldest and most varied subgenres of horror fiction, spanning not only decades or even centuries, but millennia of human history. And yet, there's no realm of kaiju horror in Ravenloft's Domains of Dread. So let's make one, and discuss some tips for running giant monsters and tabletop role-playing games generally. Welcome to PhD&D everyone, I'm Dr. Bowers, and today we're going to discuss kaiju horror in TTRPGs, as well as flesh out a Ravenloft domain based on one of my very favorite horror novels, John Langan's The Fisherman from 2016. As with all my Ravenloft videos, we're going to talk about what the domain is, list some influential media to help us get an imaginative grip on that domain, and then sketch out an adventure. Before we get started, however, I want to draw a distinction between kaiju horror and kaiju action, for lack of a better term. Kaiju horror is just that. It's a subgenre of horror fiction where the goal of the fiction is to frighten, disgust, or humble the audience with the presence of something gigantic. This is very different from exciting the audience with action scene thrills, where the giant monster is getting punched by giant robots or bombed by spaceships or doing something else that's fantastically whimsical and action-oriented. The latter is kaiju action, the former is kaiju horror. Power Rangers are kaiju action, Cloverfield is kaiju horror, for example. This is, of course, a distinction that admits of degrees, and there are many borderline cases, but I wanted to mention up front that the goal of this video is to discuss running kaiju horror in your tabletop role-playing game sessions, not kaiju action. Now, if you want some really fun kaiju action for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, I highly recommend James Introcaso's adventure, Invasion from the Planet of Tarrasques. It's a level 20 one-shot, and you can buy it on DM's Guild for pretty cheap. I ran it, I enjoyed it, my players enjoyed it, and it's really fun. You get to fight a bunch of Tarrasques, and they all have multiple heads and laser eyes and breath weapons and all that fantasy stuff. So if you want to run kaiju action, run that, but if you want to run kaiju horror, keep watching this video. As mentioned earlier, we're going to take imagery and ideas from the 2016 novel The Fisherman, take them directly, and use them in the construction of a Ravenloft Domain of Dread, complete with a Dark Lord and an adventure. I want to be clear about this. I'm taking imagery and ideas from John Langan's novel, and I'm rendering them in a much simpler medium. I'm going to leave a lot out and change some things that I leave in, but in general, if at any point in the discussion of the adventure you think, wow, that is a really cool image, or wow, that is a really captivating idea, the credit should go to John Langan, not to me. Now, with all that out of the way, our Ravenloft Domain of Dread is called DUTCHMAN'S CREEK. What's that? Well, do not go to DUTCHMAN'S CREEK, which crouches by the reservoir. Something huge dwells far below it, and the thrash of its mighty bulk is enough to disturb the dead. Things come back in DUTCHMAN'S CREEK, things that have perished and should have stayed gone. There's only one person who knows why. A man who dwells in a big black house. They call him the Fisherman. They say he wields the dark arts. They say he has hooked a great power to his line, the oldest and most titanic power, the Leviathan. All this is true, yet he still struggles to reel it in. He has not yet drawn up the Leviathan with a hook. He does not yet possess the magic he wants. So the fisherman's wizardry continues, affecting the land, drawing wrath from the most colossal being in existence. DUTCHMAN'S CREEK is a small town next to a gigantic reservoir ruled by its wealthiest citizen, a mysterious wizardly man known to most as simply the Man in the Black House, but known to a few by his arcane title, the Fisherman. Nobody knows his real name. From his secluded hilltop abode, the fisherman works with magic to ensnare the Leviathan, a colossal monster that dwells not only beneath the sea, but beneath everything, beneath the world. By ensnaring the Leviathan, the fisherman would have total power. And yet he has only sunk one hook in the jaw of the monster. He has only a fraction of the power he covets. And so the fisherman keeps working, and as he does, the Leviathan lashes out, shaking the town of DUTCHMAN'S CREEK, cursing its waters, and really endangering the whole world. Now, when it comes to inspirational media for imagining this domain of dread and also for imagining other kaiju horror that you might run in your tabletop role-playing games, we have to start with the 2016 novel The Fisherman by John Langan. This is a literarily rich novel about grief and loss, as well as a sea monster, or sea monsters. It could be read as a retelling of or a commentary on the Book of Job, or Herman Melville's Moby Dick, albeit with a dash of Stephen King's Pet Sematary thrown in. It's an amazing novel, one of my favorites, and to be honest, I feel a little guilty taking this work of art and straining it for its adventuresome elements just to present them as a role-playing game adventure. In my defense, I must say that when you read this novel, you will want to play in its imaginative spaces, and so that's what I'm doing here. I also recommend The Foghorn, a short story by Ray Bradbury from 1951. It's a very short piece, but it also blends together the themes of grief, loss, unrequited longing, and the horror of a giant monster rising from the sea. It's very good and very influential. In fact, it led to not only one, but two film adaptations, which are very different from each other. The first is the 1953 black and white film, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, where a stop-motion dinosaur terrorizes New York. This film jettisons any symbolism about grief or loss, and it treats the monster as a biological problem that admits of a biological solution. They take an interesting science fiction angle on it, and it's fun for that reason. The other film adaptation of Ray Bradbury's The Foghorn is the 2019 short film Howl from Beyond the Fog. All of the characters in this film are rendered as miniature puppets, and there's a lot of marionette work in this film that's very impressive. And the film focuses on a tragic relationship between a blind woman and a blind lake monster. It, too, really leans into the themes of sadness and grief, and blends them well with the idea of a lake-bound monstrosity. It's set in feudal Japan, and speaking of Japan, we also have to recommend the 1954 classic Godzilla. This is the first one, the original one, where Godzilla is a mysterious force of nature possessing the power of a bomb blast. This is no frolicsome, lovable Tokyo mascot. In this film, Godzilla is doom. Alongside the original Godzilla, it's of course important to include the 2007 found footage film Cloverfield, which I regard as one of the best kaiju horror movies ever made. The choice to make the film a found footage one, in particular, helps emphasize the helplessness of the protagonists, the immensity of the monster, and the mysteries of its origin. Released the same year as Cloverfield, I also recommend the 2007 horror film The Mist, based on Stephen King's novella of the same name. This film also deals with claustrophobia and giant monsters, and the viewer has the privilege of some really excellent build-up, first seeing little monsters, and then bigger monsters, and then bigger monsters, and then, well, things get pretty intense towards the end. The whole movie has a very bleak tone, and you can make an excellent tabletop adventure out of its narrative, too. You could also do this with the 2020 horror film Underwater, which also deals with claustrophobia and giant monsters. However, this time the terror is underneath the sea, taking place at a deep drilling station at the very bottom of the Mariana Trench. If you enjoy thalassophobia and Lovecraftian creatures, this film is for you. There's also the excellent 2022 film Nope by Jordan Peele, which I count as a monster movie of sorts. Like many other items on this list, there's a lot of symbolism, in particular symbolism about animals, the entertainment industry, making spectacles of something, and what happens if you dangerously mix those three things. I also recommend Godzilla -1 from 2023. Like its 2016 predecessor Shin Godzilla, this film puts Godzilla exactly in the genre where he belongs: horror. While soft on symbolism, the film goes hard on everything else, especially the disaster scenes, the action, and the immensity of the titular antagonist. I'd say this might be the best Godzilla film ever made, matched only perhaps by the original 1954 picture. There's also the 2005 video game Shadow of the Colossus for PlayStation 2, which I recommend because it offers a fun idea of what it would be to battle a giant monster. A giant monster should not just be a bag of hit points that you can hit with a sword or shoot with an arrow. In Shadow of the Colossus, we get the intriguing idea of scaling a giant beast, climbing onto it, trying to find its secret weak points, and then taking it down. Great stuff to adapt into your tabletop role-playing sessions. There's also the 2017 novel Born by Jeff Vandermeer. It features a genetically engineered flying grizzly bear the size of an aircraft carrier named Mord, and the struggle of a woman and her alien companion to escape its devastation. I've recommended this book before when discussing the Ravenloft Domain of Haslin, link in the doobly-doo, and I recommend it again here. Finally, I must recommend the 2023 short fiction collection by Paul Tremblay, The Beast You Are. If you love giant monsters, you need to read the work of Paul Tremblay, and this collection in particular. In addition to having 3 stories about giant monsters, there's also the titular novella, which concerns not only a kaiju, but a whole world of anthropomorphic animals, like some grimdark version of Richard Scarry's Busytown. It's also written entirely as a free verse poem, and it's absolutely delightful. Okay, with imaginative media out of the way, let's sketch out our adventure. Our adventure takes PCs from level 6 up through level 12 across 5 acts. This means they will play through part of the adventure at level 12 at the very end, and then, at the very end, may level up to 13 with DM's permission. In terms of maps and monsters, we're going to use materials from Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, Ghosts of Saltmarsh, and the recent Phandelver and Below, The Shattered Obelisk. The adventure assumes that the PCs either live in Dutchman's Creek, or have been visiting long enough to get a house and befriend the mayor. In Act 1, the PCs are level 6. George, a community leader, asks the PCs to go and investigate a disturbance out by the edge of the reservoir. When they do, they catch a glimpse of the fishermen before natural disaster strikes, an earthquake and a colossal wave that smashes into the town, destroying much of it and killing many. The disaster kills George's wife, Helen, and the PCs must care for George's children while he grieves. In Act 2, the PCs are level 7. After caring for his children following his drunken disappearance, the PCs are visited by George, who reveals that he's found a way to bring his wife back from the dead. It's clear that she's a monster, however, and this leads to a battle, which in turn exposes the PCs to a danger far greater than anything they have ever experienced. In Act 3, the PCs are level 8. They confront George, only to be attacked by horrific monsters that he literally vomits up. After the battle, as he is dying, George tells the PCs where to find the man who raised his wife from the dead, a man called the Fisherman. In Act 4, the PCs are level 9, and they travel to the Fisherman's abode, a black house up on a hilltop. They travel into its depths, which lead impossibly into a midnight forest at the edge of an ocean that teems with the bulk of a giant sea monster. There's a battle between the PCs and the Fisherman, at whose conclusion, one of the heads of the Leviathan rears up out of the water and swallows both PCs and Fishermen alike, the latter cackling as it happens. And finally, in Act 5, the PCs go from level 10 to level 12, and they must escape the twisted eldritch innards of the Leviathan which has swallowed them. There's only one way to do this, and that's to head down further into its depths to find the Fisherman and slay him. This part of the adventure specifically uses and repurposes Chapter 8 from Phandelver and Below, The Shattered Obelisk, Beyond a Lightless Star. That's the outline, so let's begin. In Act 1, at level 6, the PCs are resting in their house at DUTCHMAN'S CREEK, for which we'll use the map of the Hermitage from Chapter 7 of Ghosts of Saltmarsh, from the adventure called Tamarat's Fate. There's a knock at the door. It's George, a community organizer, and he showed up with his family, his wife Helen, and his 3 children, Gretchen, Clara, and Lottie. George tells the PCs that a cloaked figure is proselytizing at the edge of the great reservoir. It's disturbing quite a few of the people, including his poor family, and he wants the PCs to go investigate it, and if possible, put a stop to it. As an extra incentive, George will mention that the young dragon Loarnazel is visiting, a creature who's always fun to talk to, but who, by himself, cannot really handle this task. Assuming the PCs proceed to the great reservoir's edge, they find a bearded man in a black cloak and a broad-rimmed hat. His head is tilted down to hide his face, but with his hands held high, he proclaims that the town must surrender to him, surrender their strength. If they don't, he warns, the entire world will be rent asunder by a series of disasters. The man only answers questions obliquely with rhetoric that's full of doom and gloom. He says that there's something below the world, and it is coming. As the PCs interact with him, they are approached by a young amethyst dragon. This is the dragon Loarnazel, who asks what's going on. The proselytizing man does not heed any requests or orders, and if the PCs either attempt to cast a spell on him or lay a hand on him, he immediately vanishes. As soon as he vanishes, the earth begins to quake, people begin to scream, and some monsters climb out of the great reservoir to attack the PCs. For a battle map, you could use a gridded map of any seaside or lakeside town. I prefer the one from the adventure Madman at the Bridge on page 32 of the Kobold Press book Midgard Sagas. It has just the right sort of scale, I think. For the monsters, let there be as many Chuuls as there are PCs, with another 3 or 4 to keep Loarnazel busy. Once the PCs defeat those Chuuls, Another wave of Chuuls approaches and attacks, the same in number as before. Now, during the first wave of attackers, the Earth is shaking, it's an earthquake. So, at the start of each round, each PC must succeed on a DC 12 dexterity saving throw or fall prone. Now, during the second wave of attackers, the earthquake stops, and instead all the water draws back away from the edge of the great reservoir where the PCs are. It reveals that the reservoir is a deep chasm and they cannot even see the bottom of it. Meanwhile, across on the reservoir's other edge, a huge, colossal wave higher than a skyscraper begins to form and careen towards the town. So during the second wave of attackers, at the start of each round, each PC must succeed on a DC 12 Wisdom saving throw or else be frightened for that round. Now, once the second wave of attackers are defeated, or once the PCs effectively flee from them, the gigantic wave slams into the town of DUTCHMAN'S CREEK, shattering wood, obliterating stone, and knocking the PCs unconscious. In their unconsciousness, the PCs reach level 7, and we proceed to Act 2. In Act 2, at level 7, the PCs wake up in their house. George is watching over them, and his 3 daughters are with him. As they regain consciousness, George tells them that many buildings have been destroyed, many people have been killed, and even more people are missing. The dragon Lawarnazel is missing, and his wife Helen has been killed. When George mentions that his wife Helen is killed, he starts to weep, and every PC should attempt a DC 15 Wisdom Perception check. Anyone who succeeds notices that George stinks of alcohol. George is a mess. He asks the PCs to watch over his daughters while he goes and grieves and attends to affairs, a request which the children themselves echo. So, over the next week or 2, PCs should make various ability checks and describe what they're doing in order to entertain the children, placate the children, take care of the children, and DM should feel free to narrate the success or the failure of these checks. Surprisingly, the children handle their mother's death much better than George, who just doesn't show up for the entire time. He's gone missing. Now, when George finally does show up a week or 2 later, it's late at night. He knocks at the door, and he has a big grin on his face and a wild expression. He immediately asks for his daughters. He wants to bring them to show them a miracle. Something miraculous has happened. This is likely going to make the PCs nervous. They'll do insight checks. And if they roll high enough, they should indeed see that something is kind of off with George. Whether they let the kids go with him or not, the result is the same. George stands aside, revealing, in the distance, a woman. It's Helen, except for there's something odd about her. Her clothes are dripping with seawater, her skin is covered with pale white scales, and her eyes glint the color of gold, like the eyes of a fish. The children scream in terror, refusing to comply as George tries to call them over to meet their mother. Now, if the PCs do nothing, there's just a brief standoff. George and Helen will eventually go away, and Helen will return the next morning for a confrontation. If the PCs attack or cast any kind of offensive magic at Helen or at George, however, Helen vanishes and George walks home. In this case, too, Helen will show up the following morning for a confrontation. Under no circumstances will the children willingly leave the PCs and go with George and Helen. They are scared and they don't like what's happening. Now, when Helen returns, it is the next morning. The sky is iron gray and there's a slight drizzle, and she knocks at the door and just says in a gurgling voice, "The children." Again, the children are scared, they don't want to go with her, and if the PCs refuse to let her in or refuse to let her near the children, she will simply walk around to the side of the house, burst through the wall with sheer force, tearing away at its beams, and then attack the PCs. She has the statistics of a vampiric jade statue from Ghosts of Saltmarsh, except her creature type is aberration and her size is medium. She fights until she has 0 hit points. Once Helen has 0 hit points, she doesn't collapse or go unconscious or even die, however. Instead, she staggers back and starts laughing. Her laugh is a series of harsh, wet, wheezing monosyllables that's horrible to hear. And as it echoes in the PC's ears, they realize to their horror that it's not really laughter, it's some kind of guttural language. With this realization, their vision fades, and they suddenly find themselves transported elsewhere. The PCs immediately appear on the deck of a large ship being pushed to and fro by the tide of an endless black ocean that stretches out in every direction. The sky is black with storm clouds, yet the perpetual crackle of lightning keeps everything illuminated bright as day. For a map, we'll use a galley ship from the Ghosts of Saltmarsh appendix. and we're going to describe two more disturbing features of this environment. The first is that, bobbing up and down in the black ocean are countless pale humanoids. Only their heads are visible. Many of them resemble people that the PCs have met, except in each case their skin is covered in pale white scales and their eyes glint with the color of gold like fish eyes. The second disturbing feature is that massive black shapes roll and careen in the black ocean in the distance. They're larger than the ship, larger than islands, and indeed, larger than anything the PCs have ever seen. Titanic dorsal fins soon reveal the truth. These are the coils of an impossibly huge sea serpent. Suddenly, pale-scaled, fish-eyed duplicates of the PCs leap from out of the black ocean, out of the water, onto the deck of the ship, and attack. There are as many duplicates as there are PCs, one corresponding to each of whose eyes glint with the color of gold. And each of the duplicates has the statistics of a scum from Ghosts of Saltmarsh, except for they are bound to the Leviathan in the Black Ocean rather than in Aboleth, and in this environment the ocean spray is enough to keep them in contact with water. The scum duplicates fight to the death, and as they do so they scream horrible, hideous, violent obscenities at the PCs. Halfway through the battle, a colossal dorsal fin splits the boat in two, so that each PC must succeed on a DC 15 dexterity saving throw at the start of their turn, or else fall prone and slide 5 feet towards the black water. Once all the scum duplicates are defeated, a colossal serpentine head rises up out of the deep, reveals a mouthful of countless teeth, each one of which is at least 10 times the size of the ship, and then dives to swallow the ship whole, dragging it down to airless depths. Once the ship is swallowed, the PCs suddenly find themselves back in their house, surrounding Helen like they were before, except for each of the PCs finds themselves screaming the horrible obscenities that they thought that their duplicates were screaming during that vision. And despite it being a vision, the wounds that the PCs accrued in that vision are real. They got injured there. As for Helen, her body immediately transforms into a column of slimy water, which collapses to the floor with a wet slap. Outside, the PCs can see that it's already nightfall. An entire day has passed. Whatever the PCs do at this point, they reach level 8 and we proceed to Act 3. In Act 3, at level 8, the PCs should realize that if anyone knows what's going on, it's George, and they should set about to talk to him. Now, George lives in a repurposed fishing boat, which is propped upright on land not far from the PC's house. It was left intact from the giant flood. For a map and a description, we're going to use Mr. Dory's house from Chapter 8 of Ghosts of Saltmarsh from the adventure called The Styes. The only changes we're making are, first, that it's not suspended high up in the air, it's on the ground, and second, there aren't any monsters in there. Yet. George is inside and he welcomes the PCs in. He's clearly malnourished and sleep-deprived, but still alive with manic energy. He won't say much other than it's a miracle that Helen returned, that Helen will return again, and everything is going to be glorious, just glorious. In order to get more information out of George, PCs need to make skill checks with the DC of 17. They could try intimidating him, or persuading him, or deceiving him, or doing some other act that would compel him to talk. If any PC fails such a skill check, George staggers back and involuntarily belches a cloud of acid, inflicting 2d4 points of acid damage onto the PC who failed. He apologizes and says he isn't feeling well. After one successful check, George adds the following bit of information. It's a man. It's a man who brought Helen back. A man who knows what it's like to lose something. He knows what it's like to lose. And that will get mixed in with his talk about how great it is that Helen has returned and how miraculous it all is. After 2 successful checks, George adds this bit of information. He doesn't ask for much. He doesn't ask for what you don't have. He only asks for your strength. You need to give him your strength. You must drink from his cup and give him your strength, and he will restore to you what you lost. And that gets mixed in with the other bits of talk. Now, after 3 successful checks, George adds the following ominous bit of information. There is a great power which he has harnessed and draws up from the deep, with ropes woven from the hair of 10,000 dead men, and with hooks forged from the swords of 100 dead kings. The power of this power will be his. And that gets mixed in with the other bits of speech as well. Finally, after 4 successful checks, George adds, he's a fisherman, and then immediately bursts into laughter at the absurdity of this statement. As he laughs, he begins to choke, As he begins to cough, and he collapses to his knees before vomiting. He vomits gallons. And the gallons are not gallons of just liquid, but something chunky. Countless tadpoles. He's vomiting up thousands of tadpoles, gallons and gallons of tadpoles, and each tadpole has only one eyeball, glinting gold like the eye of a fish. As George collapses to the floor, the hideous tadpoles coalesce and form into two zombie clots, which immediately attack the PCs. We're going to say that these zombie clots lack the undead fortitude trait, and their creature type is aberration rather than undead. Once the PCs defeat these monsters, George calls them over to where he lies, dying. The last thing he tells the PCs is that the man, the fisherman, lives in a big black house on a hill, and he describes where it is. That's where the fisherman draws his power. George then dies, and it cannot be helped. Something fell and cursed afflicts his system. Once he dies, there's a brief and small earthquake, and then the PCs level up to 9, and we proceed to Act 4. Act 4 begins with the level 9 PCs seeking out the black house of the fisherman on the hill. As the PCs journey to it, there is at least one more earthquake which splits the ground, revealing a trench of black ocean seawater. Out of it crawl a quartet of chewels, that is 4 chewels, which attack the PCs and fight to the death. As the PCs approach the black house, 2 things happen. First, time lurches forward so that it is suddenly night, no matter what time it was before. Second, 4 sky-high walls of black ocean water suddenly burst forth from the ground and stream upward into the night. Like reverse waterfalls, these walls of water hem the PCs in and make it so that they cannot get further away from the black house, but only move toward it. Within these walls of water, which stand parted like the Red Sea around Moses, the PC can see, swimming throughout, a number of those hideous duplicates that they saw and fought in their vision. Humanoids, with pale fishy skin and eyes that glint of gold, like Helen when she came back. If the PCs wish to engage with these duplicates, they find no shortage of combatants. They all have the statistics of scum, but no amount of fighting or magic can move the PCs further away from the Black House. They must go in. As for the Black House itself, it cannot be damaged or affected by magic or class abilities in any way. The door is unlocked, though. Strangely, impossibly, inside the house appears to be a forest beneath a night sky, and a different night sky than the one that was above the PCs before. For one thing, it permanently crackles with lightning, making it as light as day. The dirt floor, is it really a floor? Slopes downward among the trees, and as the PCs head down, they soon hear the roar of the ocean. They arrive on a beach where, before them, there lies 4 decapitated bulls, each one larger than an elephant and gleaming with golden fur. The heads of the bulls are mounted on hooks, and each hook is larger than a galley ship. At the end of each hook is a rope, thick as a house, which stretches out into the dark, beyond the reach or the trace of the PCs. As for the ocean itself, it is black and churns with the very same monstrous shape, the very same impossibly colossal sea serpent that the PCs viewed in their vision. It's the Leviathan. Also on the beach is the man that the PCs saw proselytizing in Act 1. It's the Fisherman. He's accompanied by another pale-scaled, golden-eyed humanoid with the statistics of a scum, we'll call them Leviathan spawn, which he immediately sends to attack the PCs. As for the Fisherman himself, we're going to give him the statistics of a Jiangshi, except that he does not have Jiangshi weaknesses. He has maximum hit points, 3 uses of legendary resistance, and his creature type is not undead, but monstrosity. When the Fisherman is reduced to 0 hit points, he does not die or fall unconscious or collapse either, but like Helen, staggers back and begins to cackle. He points upward, as a colossal head of the sea-bound Leviathan rears up, then strikes down, swallowing the PCs in the Fisherman whole, the latter of whom cackles madly. Everything goes black, and the PCs reach level 10 as we proceed to Act 5. Now, for the adventure's 5th act, the PCs must navigate the twisted eldritch entrails, the guts, as it were, of the Leviathan. They must track down the Fisherman and slay him in order to escape. And for this act, we're going to run Chapter 8, Beyond a Lightless Star, from the adventure Phandelver and Below, the Shattered Obelisk. We're going to take all of Chapter 8, starting with the briny maze, and just run it as written with only a few changes. First, while they are in these dungeons, the sky looks like an envelope of skin or flesh which pulses with visible blood vessels. Second, change the Duergar and the Githyanki into starving, deranged humanoids, many of whom might have gone missing during the flood in Act 1. Keep the statistics the same, but just describe them as twisted human beings. Third, describe all the mind flayers as having pale white scales with golden-colored fish eyes. They're still mind flayers, statistically speaking, but they look like a cross between mind flayers and those Leviathan spawn from previous acts. Fourth, the dragon Lowarnazel, who is in these guts, is happy to see the PCs. He's been trapped here since Act 1. And if you were wondering in Act 1, why is there a dragon there, it's foreshadowing for this part of this dungeon. It turns out that Beyond a Lightless Star makes use of this dragon, and it's very hard to take away and then change everything. So we're keeping the dragon and just making it present from the very beginning of the adventure. Fifth, change the villainous character of Ilveyash to the Fisherman. Keep all the statistics the same, except for change his creature type to Monstrosity, and describe him as looking like the Fisherman. Once he transforms into a refraction of Ilveyash for the final battle, describe how the Fisherman grows in size, his skin grows covered with white fish scales, and his eyes glint the color of gold like that of a fish. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there is no way for the PCs to leave these dungeons other than by going through and finding the Fisherman and slaying him. There's no teleportation out, no gate that leads out so they can have a quick nap at home or anything like that. They're trapped there until they proceed to the end. Now, if you run these dungeons as written, the PCs should level up twice before the final battle, so they will confront the Fisherman in his twisted form when they are level 12. Once they defeat him, there's a crackle of thunderous lightning, the rush of the ocean, and everything is plunged into black, icy water. When the PCs come to, they're in the ruins of the Black House. Covered in seawater, a cold gray mist rises from the ground, wrapping everything in fog, and in the fog the PCs may be able to catch a glimpse of the Fisherman with glinting eyes of gold, cursing at them as he fades away. The Fisherman will doubtlessly return, but as for the PCs, they have completed this adventure. Maybe they'll stay behind and rebuild Dutchman's Creek, or maybe they will venture into the fog, into the mists of the Shadowfell, to be transported into another Ravenloft Domain of Dread. And that's our adventure. What do you think? Did I do any justice to The Fisherman for those of you who have read it? For those of you who haven't read it, do you want to read it now? What would you add to this adventure to make it more eldritch or strange? What would you add to make it more themed like a kaiju adventure? Let me know in the comments. Thanks very much for watching as always. Don't forget to do all the internet things, click like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell icon if you want notifications about new videos that are coming up on this channel. And thanks!